Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so glad you could join us. I assume you can all hear me at this point, right? Again, I'm very excited to share this story. I'm going to do this in several parts. First, I will tell you again how I got so fascinated the last 18 years in the life of this heroic man. Then I will tell you his biography and what made him the hero that he became, his character, and tell you a little bit how he got to go to Vichy, France to save over between 2,000 and 4,000 people. And then we will show you a short film about the time actually that he was there. And then I will tell you what happened to Varian Fry when he came back to this country. It's very sad. Okay, let's begin. As Grace had said, one day I was reading the Ridgefield paper in my home in Ridgefield on Shields Lane. And I saw this article with a picture of Varian Fry. And I started reading, and being an artist, I read that he saved Max Ernst and Marc Chagall and Nobel Prize winners and scientists. I couldn't believe it. He lived a few miles from me on Olmsted Lane. So a few weeks later, there was a lecture at his former home on Olmsted Lane. And who was speaking but Justice Rosenberg? I have a picture right here of him, and I'll put it on the table. Justice Rosenberg was 16 when he helped rescue people in Fry's office. It was an office of maybe 5 people. At the time he spoke in the home, he was in his late 80s. Everyone who was interested in history was at that house, including the mayor. They ran out of seats. My husband and I were very inspired by hearing the feats that they had accomplished. My husband and I wanted to pay our respects to Varian Fry wherever he was buried. And that was the mission we wanted to do. Unfortunately, a year later, my husband passed away very suddenly, and my beloved mother also died 3 weeks before. So my world was crushed. And soon after, I decided that I would follow what Francis and I wanted to do, which was to find out where Varian Fry was buried, to pay my respects. It took a lot of research. It's not like today when you go to Google and find out. So finally, I did find out where he was buried. He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And I called them. They knew nothing about him. And so I told them about this hero. And I sent them literature. Well, the following month, in their monthly magazine, there was a whole article about Varian Fry. So I was very proud that I achieved that. And later on, when I was able to physically go there, the guide took me to Varian Fry's, where he's buried. And if you ever go to that cemetery, it's very interesting. There's a little train that doesn't run all the time, all around the cemetery. Only well-known, famous people are buried there. Politicians, Tiffany. And there we came to Fry's, his stone. And the guide said to me, would you mind, please, giving a little talk about Varian Fry to docents from nearby Brooklyn Museum that are visiting? I said, no. So by the end of my little talk, I had them crying and myself. So that was my experience at Greenwood Cemetery. And you don't have to do research, that's where he is. So after learning where Varian Fry was buried, I did a lot of research. It was like layers of an onion. peeling and peeling and meeting so many interesting people on this journey. I met his son, Jim Fry, in the city because he now teaches at Rochester University. I met Jees Landsberger. How many of you knew Jees Landsberger? She lived very close to town, and she was in her 80s. She was interned in a concentration camp in France. Many of you don't know this, but there were 125 concentration camps in France. And Jees was interned in Gers. Her husband and father-in-law were at another camp. Her father was an editor of a very well-known paper in Berlin. And she told me of the terrible conditions. There was no roof, they were on straw. When it rained, the straw got wet. There were no toilets, there was no toilet paper. Anyway, I convinced Jees to come with me to the Ridgefield Library. How many of you went to that talk? Anybody? I guess it was 10 years ago, I'm not sure. And Jees came with me and we spoke. They had to bring in tons more chairs. We had at least 100. There's a very nice crowd here today. And I also convinced her to come to the Newtown Library where I now live in Newtown. Anyway, other people I met Peter Stein. Peter Stein, his father, is the photographer of this famous picture of Einstein. And Mr. Fry saved Fred Stein. And a few years ago, there was a retrospective of Fred Stein's work at a Berlin museum, and a beautiful book of his photography, and it was dedicated to who? Varian Fry. I also met Jeanette Berman. These will be on the table, so you'll be able to see her. Jeanette Berman was another survivor I found. She died a few years ago, unfortunately. A lovely lady, and she went to a few lectures trying to keep Varian Fry's name alive. And she lived close to my nephew. So for 2 Thanksgivings, she was at our Thanksgiving dinner. And I took her out to lunch a few times. She was living in a home. And Varian Fry had saved her and her mother and father, and spoke wonders of this marvelous man. Other people I have met, Sheila Eisenberg. She's the editor of one of the best books. I have the book here, and if you want to delve further into this subject, her book, A Hero of Our Own, meaning in Connecticut. So she's another one. And here is a photograph of me at the cemetery that day. I have also met the Fry family. Unfortunately, this is a lesson I'm going to pass on to you. One day, I was to go into the city to meet Annette Fry and her daughter. And it was a terrible rainstorm. And I said, I'll go another day. When you get an opportunity like that, you never, no matter the weather bad, you've got to go because it never comes again. And another thing I'd like to say to you, this is a passion of mine, including my 4 cats and my garden. But everyone should have a passion in life. And if you don't have one, get one, because it keeps you young. And it gives you purpose. Okay, so now we're going on how the background of Fry. Fry was a nerdy kid, a loner. He loved birding and gardening. And at a young age, he was raised by his 2 aunts because his mother was very sickly. His father was a stockbroker, and they lived in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Now, digressing a little, Ridgewood, New Jersey is the only place I know of a monument for Varian Fry. This Jeanette Berman that I told you about, she used her own funds in the library to get a beautiful stone monument in front of the library. And today, there's a beautiful library and all kinds of things about Fry at that library. Now, just a week ago, I remember from my reading, there was a sign from Ridgefield High School that Varian Fry had taught there. So I called the school, and they didn't know what I was talking about, but they gave me the librarian. She said, yes, there is a sign of Varian Fry. However, it's in a small library, not where the students are. It's next to an extinguisher, and no verbiage about it. So nobody knows what this sign Varian Fry means. So I wrote to the principal, and I've been invited to talk at the library. And let's hope that that sign gets moved to the main library so students could say, that man taught at my school. So I know I'm digressing a little, but let's get back to Fry. At the age of 14, he was sent to Hotchkiss, our neighbor in Lakeville. And he complained to the headmaster. He wasn't very happy about the bullying and the hazing. So the headmaster, he took the headmaster, and soon he said to him, look, Fry, this is our tradition. And so Varian Fry ended up at the Taft School. And finally we find him at Harvard, where he majored in the classics and became an editor with another student of an art magazine, the latest artists in Europe and in this country. Fast forward, when he finished Harvard, he married, just before he met a woman by the name of Eileen, around 6 years older than him, and also a writer, and they moved to New York City, 1935. Of course, it was the Depression and a difficult time, but they thought he'd find work, and he became an editor of a political magazine. Now, what was happening in Germany at this time? There was rumors of Jews being persecuted. So Varian Fry was sent to Berlin in 1935. And he saw for himself Jews being pulled from the street, pushed to the ground. He went for a coffee or a beer and found a man who looked Jewish and a brown shirt, took a hammer and a nail and hammered his hand to the table. That was the mood. And then the next day, Varian Fry met with an ex-Harvard student, 10 years, who graduated before him, and said, look, Hitler has two plans for the Jews. It's to either send them to another country or annihilate them. So in 1935, Varian Fry, and the article is in these books, wrote to the New York Times, this was Hitler's mission. So it wasn't a secret about this annihilation plan. It was out there in 1935. So Varian Fry came back and continued his writing duties. And in 1940, in the old Commodore on 42nd Street, there was the beginning of the International Rescue Committee, then known as the Emergency Rescue Committee. Because word got out that there was a list of famous artists, Chagall, Ernst, etc., scientists that were going to be annihilated. So the museum in the city, several of them got together and said, we've got to get these people out. And so they had a meeting, and they needed someone to go to Vichy, France, with passports and visas, to find these people and get them out. A dangerous mission. Varian Fry was the only one to volunteer. So he was nerdy, he didn't know anything about James Bond stuff, but he was picked. And they raised $3,000 which was a lot at the time. It was strapped to his pants, and off he went to Vichy, France. Now, why Vichy, France? The Germans came and divided France in the 1940s, okay? So they chose this little town, Vichy, which was a spa, a little town, sleepy town. I think it's still a spa town. And anything south of that was known as Vichy, France. And what did that mean? That meant it was a free zone. The north, everybody from Paris quickly got to the south where they thought they could get out on boats. People who escaped concentration camps all over Europe, they all fled to Paris and then to France, thinking they could get out on boats. But soon, there was a decree called surrender on demand, and that was for all of France. So anybody who looked suspicious could be taken off the street, taken to a camp, no questions asked. So there is Fry at this period of time. He arrives in Marseille, and he goes immediately to the consulate where he thought he would get help. He saw lines of professional doctors, lawyers, all kinds of people begging for help. And the consulate was not there to offer them any help. So Fry knew he was on this mission by himself. So he went to the Hotel Splendide and developed an office where they got 5 workers. And one of them was Justice Rosenberg, who I mentioned. He was called Gussie. He escaped. He had been studying, and he needed to get out. But he was such a perfect person for the office. He had blonde hair, and he looked very Aryan. So they could send him out on the street with the passports and the visas. So there were other people, too numerous to mention, they're in some of the literature. So this office had to find a way to get the people out. So they would set up a legal office to offer aid. And there were lines of people that came. And they had to determine who they were going to save. Because they were there not to just save Jewish people and artists. Varian Fry was given 3 weeks for this mission, but he stayed a total of 13 months at risk to his life. And so he saved everyone he could. And how did they do this? So at night, they would meet in the bathroom and run the water and the tub so that nobody could hear through the walls. And they determined who they could rescue. And they developed a system. Did anybody hear of the tubogram? Well, what that was, when they found that they could get people over the Pyrenees, they sent in condoms messages to the office on 42nd Street and put the condoms in toothpaste tubes. So that's what a tubogram is. Now, how were they going to get them out? The waters were all patrolled by the Germans, and the French were collaborating right and left. So they couldn't readily do that. So they came up with a brilliant idea of disguising the immigrants as vineyard workers. And at lunchtime, when the French were interested in having their lunch, they were escorted through the Pyrenees and then over, and then some through into Spain and later on to Portugal. And that's how they got a lot of people out. And I also wanted to stress that Varian Fry was of Scottish descent and Presbyterian. He was not Jewish. And he got in a lot of trouble for staying 13 months. Now, it's at this point that we're going to play the video which shows him in France.